Old-fashioned murder and mayhem. First, do no harm. The murder of James Lebeouf, 1927. Cousins Alcée Mayon and John and Cleveland Beadle guided their flat-bottomed skiff into the swollen waters of Lake Poulard in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, as the sun sank behind the cypress trees. Fingers of Spanish moss waved gently in the hot breeze as mosquitoes gathered, eager to begin feasting on whatever exposed flesh they found. Floodwaters were beginning to recede following the great Mississippi flood of 1927 that July day, offering a prime opportunity for frog gigging. These experienced trappers were keen to collect a bountiful harvest of frog legs to sell to the local restaurants. Curiously, their boat scraped against an unusual object in the water. Leaning cautiously over the bow and watching for possible alligators, the trio was stunned to discover the badly mutilated body of a man. Welcome to another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. I am your host, Mindy Hudson, bringing you tales of historical true crime with the twist of genealogy. Today's story, entitled First, Do No Harm, recounts the 1927 murder of a Morgan City, Louisiana man. Tangled within the narrative are allegations of domestic discord, local gossip, a scandalous affair, and a horrific murder. Listener discretion is advised. The mighty Mississippi River covers approximately 1/8 of the entire continent of the United States. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, its headwaters begin at Minnesota's Lake Itasca and meander southward 2,340 miles, emptying into the Gulf of Mexico at Louisiana. For centuries, those living along its banks and tributaries have known, when the battle between man and floodwaters commences, the river always wins. So it was in the summer of 1926 that heavy rains fell across the river's central basin, followed by a series of substantial precipitation events. The rainfall continued throughout the winter and into the spring of 1927 and led to the most catastrophic flood in U.S. history, according to Wikipedia. Morgan City, Louisiana is located at the southern toe of the state, about 20 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. Residents descend from a mixture of Native American, Acadian, Spanish, African American, and German ancestors, among other nationalities, resulting in a rich cultural diversity known for their love of a good time, hot temper, and ability to adapt. The South Louisiana Cajun population moves to a cadence quite different from the rest of the country. Even the division of local government, called parishes instead of counties, indicates the unique flavor of the state. Morgan City lies in the path of the Mississippi River floodplain. In 1927, runoff from the Atchafalaya Basin contributed to the devastating effects of the historic flood. As floodwaters rose, families and livestock sought shelter on rooftops, raised railroad beds, and levees. In mid-May, floodwaters were predicted to reach up to 8 feet on Front Street in the small South Louisiana town. On May 17th, the levee near Krotz Springs north of Morgan City broke, and water began pouring into the outlying areas. Although it caused great devastation to those areas, the relief of water flow downstream eased the threat to the Morgan City residents. Although spared the worst of the torrent, the May 28th edition of the Morgan City Review related that several business houses had raised levels of operation to higher floors to continue serving customers. By June 1st, newspapers noted that the waters were slowly beginning to recede. The news came as a relief to Dr. Thomas Eldon Dreyer, whose home was located on 2nd Street. The doctor had been a physician in Morgan City for over 20 years, having graduated from Tulane University School of Medicine in 1897. and the National Normal University College of Medicine in Lebanon, Ohio. There he met and married the former Gertrude Crone. The couple returned to St. Mary Parish, Louisiana in 1901, where he opened his practice. The marriage produced 3 children, Dorothy, Thomas, called Ted, and Gertrude, called Polly. By 1927, the children ranged in age between 13 and 23. The Dreyer home was a comfortable 2-story frame house with a picket fence. Striped awnings shaded both upper and lower windows. Typical of most upper-class married women of the era, Mrs. Dreyer was a soft-spoken homemaker, active in various community social organizations. However, as is the case in all small towns, the polished and respectable facade of domestic and occupational bliss thinly veiled a troubling reality. It appeared the doctor, a handsome and jovial man in his early 50s, was spending too much time with one of his patients, a married woman in her late 30s. Tongues began wagging, and whispers swirled around the little community whose population numbered around 5,500 in the 1920s. The woman in question was Mrs. Ada Bonner Lebeouf, wife of James J. Lebeouf, called Jim. The Bonner and Lebeouf families had deep roots in St. Mary Parish, going back several generations. Most of the residents were interrelated by marriage, and everybody knew everybody's business. Ada Regina Bonner, born in 1889 to Charles and Virginia Bonner, was the third of 5 children. Ada's father passed away in 1903. She married James Joseph Clomadier Lebeouf in 1906 at the age of 16. Ada Lebeouf was an attractive woman with dark hair and eyes. Her elder sister Clara married Louis Blakeman, who served as a policeman in St. Mary Parish. In 1926, he was raised to the position of chief of police. James Lebeouf, born in 1884, was the son of Clodomir Lebeouf and Rosalie Seven. His father died 6 months before his birth, leaving his mother with 2 infant children, Mary Ellen and James. In 1890, she married Willie Husband, a railroad man who helped raise her children. Daughter Ellen married Benjamin Beadle, son of Francis and Lydia Beadle, in 1905. James Lebeouf and his young bride Ada remained in St. Mary Parish, where he eventually took a job at the Public Utilities and bought a modest 2-story frame house on First Street. By the 1920s, he had worked his way up to the manager position, and although not wealthy, the Lebeouf family was comfortable. The couple had 4 children, Joseph, Ernest, Herman, and Liberty, called Libby. By the mid-1920s, the 2 elder boys had grown and moved out of the house, leaving Herman a preteen and Liberty, who was still in grade school. Ada was unhappy in her marriage. According to her, Jim was jealous and violent. There were known bouts of fighting in which law enforcement was summoned. Ada suffered from migraines possibly brought on by stress and sought Dr. Dreyer's aid and counsel for relief. The relationship probably began innocently enough. However, over time, the house calls and secret meetings became a salacious open secret among the more alert citizens, and people began to talk. Eventually, someone sent an anonymous letter to Mrs. Dreyer informing her about the town's suspicions. Gertrude Dreyer loved her husband, and at first she dismissed the rumors as busybody gossip. Dr. Dreyer had provided well for her and their children. He was well loved and respected in the community and had always treated her well. Nonetheless, when a second letter arrived, Gertrude decided to discuss the matter with Jim Lebeouf to get his aid in putting the rumors to rest. To her horror, Jim became furious and began harassing the doctor. When he confronted Ada with the rumors, she denied there was anything unseemly going on between them, but Jim wouldn't let it rest. The fights grew so intense that Jim threw his wife out of the house several times in 1925. She fled to her parents' or her sister's homes until he cooled off. Then he'd come to apologize and bring her back home. This went on for 2 years. He forbade her to see the doctor and even went to Dr. Dreyer's office and threatened to kill him if he caught him with Ada. Despite the threats, Ada and the doc, as she referred to him, continued to meet in secret. They sent notes back and forth to one another via trusted friends. Ada may have even attempted to poison Jim at one point. His mother, Rosalie Husband, later testified that in 1925 he got so sick that she believed he had been poisoned. A seed of suspicion kindled in the old woman's mind, but for the sake of the children she counseled her son to return to his wife and work things out. After this, Jim's obsession with the affair became all-consuming. According to his eldest son, his father had set various traps to catch the couple. He'd drive by the doctor's home or office dressed in Ada's clothes, carrying a gun on the seat beside him, hoping Dr. Dreyer would think it was Ada and come out to meet with her. At one point, it was said he forced her to crouch on the floor of the car with a gun aimed at her as he drove by the doctor's office, ready to shoot her if Dreyer approached. He never did. The suspicion and fighting continued for 2 years. Sometimes Ada would be ordered to leave the house, and other times Jim would disappear for a time. Eventually, the tempers would cool and there would be a fragile period of peace. In the meantime, Thomas Dreyer was growing tired of the harassment. He confided the problem to his handyman and hunting buddy, Jim Beadle. James Monroe, Jim Beadle, son of Francis and Lydia Beadle, was the brother of Benjamin Beadle, husband of Ellen Lebeouf, and was well acquainted with her brother Jim Lebeouf and his fiery temper. Some years prior, the two men had a falling out over a boat Lebeouf accused Beadle of stealing. The two men had not spoken since that incident. Jim Beadle was married to Alice Lovell and had 7 children. He worked at various odd jobs, and like most Cajuns in South Louisiana, he was an experienced hunter and fisherman. It was not uncommon for Doc Dreyer to show up at the Beadle home and call for Jim to go out to Lake Pelore in the late afternoon or evening to hunt alligators. The doctor even stored his boat and shotgun at Beadle's house for easy access on those occasions that he took a notion to go out. On the evening of Friday, July 1st, 1927, Doc Dreyer arrived at the Beadle home and called for Jim to come out to the lake with him. He instructed Jim to get the shotgun for gator hunting. They loaded the boat onto the doctor's car and headed to Lake Pelore. Along the way, Dr. Dreyer admitted they were not hunting alligators, but that Jim Lebeouf was going to be on the water that night, and he was going to put a stop to the harassment once and for all. The doctor told Jim that Ada had sent a message to him that Lebeouf would be on the lake that evening and would be in the area where the school was located around 8 p.m. If Beadle had any qualms about what they were about to do, his loyalty and trust in the doctor outweighed those doubts. At the same time, Jim and Ada were heading to the lake. Ada later claimed that she had lured her husband out to the lake for an evening ride to patch up their relationship. However, she also said that they were going out to the lake to meet with Dr. Dreyer to try to work out a peaceful resolution to the animosity between them. Both stories seem suspicious since she and Jim were in separate boats. It is more likely that she found some way to convince her husband to be on the lake at that time and then followed to make sure he went. It is my theory that she led him to believe that she and Dreyer were planning to meet there and laid the trap knowing Jim would go out there to finally catch the pair. As Lebeouf rode to the designated spot, Dreher called out, "Jim, is that you?" What happened next is unclear. Lebeouf had his gun with him, and probably, seeing that it was Dreher, raised it to shoot him. However, 2 blasts from the shotgun hit Lebeouf in the chest. The controversy later arose about which man fired the fatal shots, Dreher or Beadle. Seeing Jim fall into the boat, Ada panicked and hastily fled the scene. The 2 men set to work to hide the body. They tied weights to the body with angle irons, totaling approximately 150 pounds. Nevertheless, the doctor knew that as the body decomposed, it would fill with gases and float to the surface of the water. To prevent that from happening, they slashed his body from throat to belly and dumped him into the water. Then they took Lebeouf's gun and dumped it in another location. It was later recovered. In the following days, Ada explained the disappearance of her husband by saying he had gone away on company business. Since it wasn't unusual for him to go away for short periods, that explanation was accepted. However, soon the utility company began questioning why Jim hadn't shown up for work. It was out of character for him. Time was running out. As all of this was unfolding, the floodwaters were dropping every day. On the evening of July 6th, John Beadle and Alcée Mayon, first cousins, picked up Cleveland Beadle, nephew of Jim Beadle, to go frog hunting. Conditions were ideal for the receding waters to offer a harvest of giant bullfrogs, which they would be able to sell to the area restaurants. They guided their flat-bottomed boat into the murky waters and scanned the area with flashlights, watching for the bright dots of light from the eyes of their prey. The boat scraped against something just beneath the surface. When they leaned over to see what it was, they expected to see a cypress log that had been dislodged in the flood, or perhaps an alligator. To their utter horror, it was the badly decomposed body of a man. The body had not floated up. The water had gone down, exposing its lurid secrets. It was impossible to identify the victim, as crabs, turtles, and alligators had found the corpse and had been feeding on it. They quickly rowed back to shore and called on Sheriff Charles Pico to report their discovery. When the body was brought to Dr. C.M. Horton, the coroner, he found the man had been shot to death and that his body had been skillfully slit open. Chief Louis Blakeman was able to identify his brother-in-law because of his unusual thumbs. James Lebeouf had short thumbs with small rectangular nails. The corpse also had false teeth like Lebeouf, and because Jim Lebeouf was missing, the identity was easily confirmed. Now the firestorm of suspicion about who had murdered Lebeouf began. The whispers about the illicit affair between Lebeouf's wife and the doctor became loud. The alleged lovers were arrested, along with Jim Beadle, who had been seen with Dreher hauling a boat on the night Lebeouf went missing. Chief Blakeman had the unhappy task of questioning his sister-in-law. He knew about the violence in the home. He also knew about the rumors of infidelity and Jim's unstable stalking of the doctor. It didn't take long for Ada to admit she had been present at the time of the murder. She claimed Lebeouf fired the first shot and that Dreher had returned fire in self-defense. She saw her husband drop into the boat and fled the scene. When asked why she went along with the murder plot, the Morning Call, Lehigh, Pennsylvania article on July 10, 1927 reported her reply, quote, "I'd rather live in hell than live with him another day," end quote. Ada denied that she and Dreher were romantically involved, but said that her husband was jealous and suspicious. When asked why she hadn't reported it, or even reported her husband missing, she said she knew there was gossip about the affair and she was afraid they wouldn't be believed. Her story kept changing. Nevertheless, considering the history of animosity between Lebeouf and Dreher, the assertion that they met on the lake for a friendly resolution seemed ridiculous. As the body of her husband was laid to rest, Ada Lebeouf was booked at the jailhouse. Her fatherless children attended his funeral without their mother present. Dr. Dreher's version of the event was that Jim Beadle shot Lebeouf and was the one who slit him open. He pointed to the fact that Beadle was a skilled hunter. He also pointed out that Lebeouf and Beadle had a history of conflict. Dreher said that he had discussed the harassment he had suffered from Lebeouf, and Beadle assured him that he could put an end to it. His confession made it appear that Beadle had come along for the sole purpose of murdering Lebeouf over a disagreement about a boat that happened 7 years earlier. This version of the story laid all the guilt on Beadle and none on Ada or the doctor. It, however, fails to explain what the doctor or Ada were even doing out there on the lake in the first place, why Ada was in a separate boat from Lebeouf, or why neither of them had reported the crime. The trial began at the end of July 1927 at the St. Mary Parish Courthouse in Franklin, Louisiana, with Judge James Simon presiding. At first, all three defendants were represented by James R. Parkinson, but when Beadle realized he was being singled out as the scapegoat, he asked to be represented by another attorney. Renee Himmel stepped in to defend Beadle. Representing the state was D.A. Emile Foulemeau. The sensational details of the alleged love triangle murder brought hordes of spectators and reporters from across the country. Throughout the trial, Ada and Dreher maintained a stoic and pleasant expression, smiling, laughing, and greeting acquaintances in the courtroom. The strain, however, was quite a bit more palpable among the extended family whose lives had been irreparably damaged due to the scandal. Mrs. Husband, the mother of the murdered man, sobbed pitifully on the first day of jury selection. Before the trial, she had come to Sheriff Pico with an envelope filled with money. Quote, "I have brought you all my savings," she said, "so that you will see that the murderers of my son are prosecuted hard." End quote. The sheriff assured her that the state would cover the cost of the trial and would see justice served. As the elderly woman was led gently from the courtroom sobbing, she was told she didn't need to be present for these proceedings. She acknowledged she was grateful to learn this, as she thought her presence was mandatory, and she didn't think she could bear it. She confided that although she did not wish them to hang, she did hope they would spend the rest of their lives in prison for what they had done. Mrs. Alice Beadle, wife of Jim Beadle, appeared in court to support her husband, even though she suffered from severe heart trouble. It was feared the pressure of the trial could kill her. 3 of their children sat with her, and their presence was an obvious comfort to Jim Beadle. Perhaps the most tragic among the spectators was Mrs. Gertrude Dreher, who sat stoically behind her husband. When questioned, she maintained that it was love and not duty that brought her there. "Can't you see that I am there because I love him?" she was quoted as saying. "Can't you see that our children are there because they love him? We have always loved him. We always will. It isn't a question of duty with us." End quote. For Mrs. Dreher, it seemed she clung to the belief that her husband had been unjustly accused of infidelity. In her mind, if he were involved at all, it was because of the intimidation and death threats from Lebeouf. She chose to believe that on the night in question, the man she loved had gone out to meet with Mr. Lebeouf, hoping for a resolution to the conflict. It made sense that he would take his trusted friend Jim Beadle with him in case there was trouble. For whatever reason, the evidence supporting premeditation and cover-up was overlooked by her. Even the judge was not immune from the strain. After the lunch recess on the first day, he became ill and had to postpone court until the evening. Ada Lebeouf and Dr. Thomas Dreyer adamantly maintained they had not been intimately involved. Nevertheless, witnesses were brought forth to testify otherwise. Mrs. Noah Hebert testified that she had passed notes between the couple for years. Edville Plasala testified that he had seen them meeting together at a house in Morgan City, and that on the night in question he had seen Mr. and Mrs. Lebeouf go out on Lake Pelluer in separate boats. His theory was that Mrs. Lebeouf didn't want to be in the same skiff as her husband because she knew he was being ambushed. "I saw her come back, but I didn't see him," he said. Louis Como lived near the schoolhouse where the murder occurred. He testified that he heard 2 shots in quick succession at about 8 o'clock that evening. It was still daylight. He was asked if he could tell what kind of weapon or weapons he heard, and he replied that he had been a hunter his whole life and that recognized the shots as coming from a shotgun. Throughout the trial proceedings, Ada Lebeouf never showed any signs of grief or remorse over the loss of her husband. The only sorrow she expressed was when a group of children playing outside the jailhouse window heard her call to them and ran away in horror. Quote, "The children heard her, saw who she was, and ran away." And Mrs. Ada Bonner Lebeouf, who sat unmoved when she heard herself charged with the conspiracy which ended the life of her husband, who calmly told of witnessing the most brutal slaying in southern Louisiana, wept when a little child ran from her. End quote. From the Alexandria Daily Town Talk, Louisiana, July 14, 1927. On August 6, 1927, the jury came back with the verdicts in the indictment. Thomas E. Dreyer and Ada Lebeouf were found guilty of the murder of James Lebeouf. Their sentence was to be death by hanging. James Beadle was found guilty without capital punishment, meaning he would serve life in prison. Mrs. Alice Beadle, not understanding that her husband was not sentenced to hang, fell apart, crying hysterically, and had to be escorted from the courtroom. Dr. Dreyer was quoted as saying, quote, "My God Almighty, I didn't expect this kind of a verdict," end quote. The chances were high that Dreyer would indeed suffer the death penalty, but most agreed that Mrs. Lebeouf's sentence would be commuted. After all, no woman had ever been hanged in Louisiana. The notion seemed absurd. In the years that followed, Dr. Dreyer and Lebeouf filed appeals and motions postponing the date of their sentence. In the end, it was up to newly elected Governor Huey Long to grant the final stay of execution. Despite the efforts of the children of Ada Lebeouf and those of Gertrude Dreyer and her daughter Dorothy, Governor Long refused to see them and put an end to any hope of escaping the sentence with the statement, quote, "I have reviewed the matter carefully, and I do not intend to take any further action. The law will have to take its course," end quote. On January 31st, 1929, the 2 older sons and the daughter of Ada Bonner Lebeouf came to visit for the last time. Herman, her 14-year-old son, was not permitted to visit, as it was deemed the experience would leave lasting trauma on him. Ada was ill from the ravages of a tumor and the strain of her predicament, and lay on her jail cot. Libby, who was only 9, clung to her mother. When she saw the distress of her children, Ada rallied to comfort them. After they departed, Ada cried for her 72-year-old mother, who could not face coming to the jail to see her daughter. The family of Dr. Thomas Dreyer also came to bid their father goodbye. Loyal to the end, Mrs. Dreyer had stood by the man who had been convicted of murdering a man whose wife was alleged to have been his lover. Both prisoners were given sedatives to help them sleep. The following morning, February 1st, Ada drank a cup of coffee and then put on a pink slip dress. The doctor asked to see Ada Lebeouf one last time, and the request was granted. About 30 minutes before she was scheduled to be led away, they spoke briefly, and his last words to her were, quote, "I hope to see you over there," end quote. At noon, 40-year-old Ada Lebeouf was escorted to the gallows. The structure was built with 2 stalls separated by a metal partition. As she approached the outside, she balked, crying out like a child, "Out there! Out there!" When she finally made it to the gallows, she looked upon the men below, puffing away on cigars, and began calling for her mother. "Oh, Mother, my God," she cried, working the beads of her rosary behind her back. "The rope is too tight around my neck." A black cloth was placed over her head. When the executioner sprang the trap door, the beads slipped from her hands. At 12:16 p.m., the first white woman to be executed by hanging in Louisiana history was pronounced dead. Shortly after, Thomas Dreyer was escorted outside. As he walked up to the trap, he commented, "Poor Miss Ada is gone." Dreyer also complained about the tightness of the rope. Until the end, Dr. Dreyer insisted he was innocent. At 12:39 p.m., 23 minutes after Ada's death, Thomas E. Dreyer was pronounced dead. He was 56. Ada Bonner Lebeouf was buried in Morgan City Cemetery beside the husband she was accused of murdering. Dr. Thomas E. Dreyer's body was taken to Clayton, Louisiana, to be interred in the family graveyard. Herman and Liberty Lebeouf, now orphaned, went to live with their aunt and Uncle Clara Bonner and Louis Blakeman. In 1933, James Beadle filed a plea with the Louisiana Pardon Board for a commutation of his sentence or a full pardon. In 1939, when he was 58, Beadle was released under a good time law that allowed a life-term prisoner's release after 10 years and 6 months, provided his prison record was good. Unfortunately, while he was in Angola prison, Beadle's youngest son, Pleasant, died. He drowned in 1935 on Lake Pelore, the very same lake that figured in the scandal involving his father. 4 teenage friends, Pleasant Beadle, Rita Luquette, Clifford Leday, and Liberty Lebeouf, were swimming when a sudden storm blew up. Pleasant saw the girls struggling and jumped in to save them. Sadly, he and Rita Luquette succumbed to the dangerous waters. Pleasant was 17 and Rita was 15. Mrs. Alice Lovell Beadle died in 1944. Jim Beadle returned to Morgan City, where he died on December 14, 1955, and is buried at Willow Grove Cemetery, St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. Mrs. Rosalie Seven Husband, mother of the slain James Lebeouf, died on July 15, 1940. 2 of Ada's sons moved to Texas, while 1 son and daughter remained in Morgan City. Liberty married Clifford Leday, the young man with her who survived the drowning in Lake Pelore. All 4 Lebeouf children lived well into their 80s or 90s. Gertrude Dreyer, the faithful widow of Dr. Thomas Dreyer, never remarried. She continued to live in Morgan City, working tirelessly in various civic and social endeavors. She was instrumental in establishing the Morgan City Library and served as librarian there. Her children married and moved away from St. Mary Parish. Gertrude passed away on May 14, 1948, at the age of 72. The Latin phrase primum non nocere, first do no harm, is commonly known to be a part of the Hippocratic oath taken by physicians. Whether intentional or not, it seems obvious that the actions of Dr. Thomas Dreyer and Ada Lebeouf left a wide swath of damaged lives. And although she was the first woman to suffer the death penalty in Louisiana, she was not the last. Thank you for listening to this episode of First Do No Harm, The Murder of James Lebeouf. I'd like to give a special shout out to my two new true crime fans, Laura Doherty and Jan Leach. I've been working on adding content to the Assistant Sleuth and Genealogy Sleuth memberships. So far, I have 2 behind-the-scenes videos relating to the series of articles written by Clara Lascelles and published in the San Francisco Examiner in 1906, which chronicle her experiences as the wife of Sidney Lascelles from February's Mummified Lord story. I also have a beginning genealogy class video ready for viewing for Genealogy Sleuth members. I'll be adding more content as memberships increase. In the meantime, please like, share, subscribe, and comment so more folks will see these videos. I appreciate all your comments and support. And join me next month for another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem.